A dead world lies just below the surface of the Coral Sea in the northeast of Australia. Like a cancer in paradise, the bleached white skeletons of millions of coral polyps warn of an invisible threat to the reef. For some reason, as yet unknown, the corals are becoming sick, losing their color and dying. And with them goes a variety of life forms which is quite unlike any other ecosystem on Earth. The Great Barrier Reef of Australia is the largest single collection of coral reefs in the world. Biologically, it supports the most diverse ecosystem known to man, a complex labyrinthine world where over 400 species of coral give life to thousands of creatures of all kinds and forms imaginable. This is a disconcerting world in which the vegetable and animal kingdoms disguise themselves, melting into their surroundings, where every movement is evidence of surprising adaptation, and where even danger and death take on an astonishing beauty. All this variety and biological wealth paradoxically depends on the coral polyps, tiny, simple creatures which join their forces in extensive colonies, built on and protected by the skeletons of millions of their ancestors. This is both the strength and the fragility of the Great Barrier Reef. Because all the life here, all the animals and plants are based on the most delicate and vulnerable of creatures. The formation of the Australian Great Barrier Reef began 25 million years ago. It developed in a warm, calm sea and became one of the most stable ecosystems in our constantly changing world. And yet, the origins of its genesis are to be found in times of great convulsions, the formation of the world as we now know it. 60 million years ago, the supercontinent Gondwana broke apart, giving rise to new and powerful seas. The island of Australia was born and began to slowly drift north. The marine currents altered their titanic flow, bringing colder waters to this southernmost continent, and the Antarctic froze over. The waters around the newly formed Australia were cold and dark, but rich in essential nutrients, and so in life. These cold seas of huge, tenebrous seaweeds can still be found off the coast of southern Australia. The kelp forests resist the battering of the rough seas, which carry the primary foods from the Antarctic sea bottom in a slow process taking thousands of years. It is a dark, icy world where it would be impossible for a reef to form. But these apparently unalterable conditions were to change radically. It was simply a question of time. "50 million years of isolation and drifting north would change the coasts and seas of Australia. It was simply a matter of time before its course brought it to the continental plate of Asia, and the inevitable collision occurred. In its slow but unstoppable rise towards the equator, the Australian plate gave birth to new islands as it pressed against the Asian plate. The islands formed barriers to the equatorial marine currents, so some of these were diverted to the eastern coast of Australia, causing profound changes in its biology and the nature of its waters. A new sea had been born, warmer and with more light than its precursor, but much poorer. It did not receive the nutrients from the polar regions, so food was scarcer, but the temperature and the light did permit the proliferation of colonies of coral with their calcareous skeletons, and the Great Barrier Reef began to form. The marine currents carry the scarce, valuable nutrients to this temperate sea. And the barrier itself ensures that they are exploited to the full. It breaks the force of the sea and filters the waters to extract every last ounce of nutrition. But the determining factor in this paradoxical world where a barren sea has become the perfect example of biodiversity are not the nutrients transported by the water, but rather something as simple as the light of the sun. In the reef, the cycle of energy and matter flows vertically from the surface to the seabed. The sunlight allows the development of photosynthetic algae, which transform the energy of the sun into the matter which feeds many of the creatures of the reef. But the majority of these algae and their vital role in the ecosystem remain unnoticed because they are not directly visible. They live and grow in the interior of the tiny architects of the reef. The coral polyps are incapable of carrying out photosynthesis, but they have formed a symbiotic relationship with the single-celled algae that do, the zooxanthellae. In the interior of the polyps, these tiny algae use the light of the sun to create energy from the carbon dioxide and the phosphorus which the corals form in the water. The zooxanthellae of a brownish-yellow color make use of the waste products of the polyps, and in return not only provide them with the majority of their food, but also make it possible for them to increase by up to 4 times their capacity to secrete calcium carbonate, a basic element in the construction of the hard skeleton which forms the coral reefs. The Great Barrier Reef is in reality a series of coral reefs extending 2,000 kilometers along the Australian continental platform. The 348 square kilometers of reefs form a formidable barrier between the continent and the incredible force of the coral sea. And it is this, the breakwater effect, which determines the 2 very different worlds, both intimately related to the reef, that of its interior, where the force of the sea has been calmed, and the outer edge, the first line of defense, where sea and coral test their strength against each other. Life on the seaward edge is marked by the currents in the sun. Here there is a great concentration of nutrients in the waters, as they have not yet been filtered by the millions of hungry polyps of the reef. The fish gather in large schools to be the first to take advantage of the meager gifts brought by the current. But for the corals here at the battlefront, life is not so easy. Here, the waters are deeper and absorb the sunlight, meaning that not enough light gets through the algae to be able to help their coral hosts generate their powerful external skeletons. As a result, the deeper waters of the outer edge of the barrier are colonized by soft corals. For the fish of the reef, this is a dangerous area. There are more nutrients on which to feed, and as a result, a greater concentration of fish. And this has not gone unnoticed by the hunters of the sea. Large schools of blackfin barracudas swarm around the open sea in search of prey. Their tapered bodies make them powerful swimmers, and their coloring provides camouflage in the open seas. From above, their backs are easily confused with the shadows of the depths, and from below, their silver-colored bellies merge into the brilliant shimmer of the surface. Like the barracudas, all the fish of the open seas are great swimmers. They all have hydrodynamic bodies, colors which provide camouflage, and powerful fins for swimming. But nonetheless, there are other specialized hunters of different zoological types who have developed more sophisticated weapons. And one of these is the sea snake. This olive sea snake hunts around the rocky bottom in search of prey. Its body has undergone important changes in the slow process which led snakes to colonize the seas of the whole world. With no ground from which to launch their attacks, the sea snakes increase the weight of their bodies at the tail end, which gives them a stable base from which to strike. These broad tails also serve as oars for propulsion, and the nasal cavities are on the top of their heads so they can breathe as they swim along the surface. But none of this serves to prevent the fish on which they feed from fleeing at great speed and losing themselves in the immense blue sea after one of their bites. And so they had to develop a poison capable of paralyzing their victims almost instantaneously. And not only did the sea snakes manage to do this, they became in fact the most poisonous snakes in the world. On this occasion, the snake is not out hunting. In exactly the same way as their relatives on land, the sea snake receives much of the information about its surroundings from its sensitive forked tongue, and this informs it that there is another sea snake prowling around in the area. A quick check is enough for both of them to realize that they are of the same sex, so they both lose interest and go their separate ways in search of possible prey and, perhaps, a receptive female. Once inside the coral reef, life is very different. Here, away from the pounding of the waves, the reef is a calm, shallow lagoon in which the hard corals, whose skeletons make up the reef, grow right up to the low tide mark. Here, the water is shallower, and the light of the sun is able to penetrate to the seabed, enabling the algae that live in the corals to carry out their work of photosynthesis. As a result, the corals grow quickly in proportion to the amount of light they receive, and many colonies of coral spread out in the shape of a fan, which acts like a kind of enormous solar panel. The sunlight not only influences the growth of the corals, but also determines to a large extent the biology of the species. In such clear, shallow waters, visibility is excellent, and so the animals have had to adapt to a world in which the most important sense is sight. And as a result, the coral reef has become one of the most spectacular displays in the animal kingdom, where creatures of every possible color and shape have come to live. All the biodiversity within this coral world is intimately linked by a delicate network of dependencies. It is a world of incredible beauty, but it is a fragile beauty which, until recently, was also the source of the greatest threat to life in the reef. Because the incredible diversity of species in this natural paradise attracted to these waters the most versatile and destructive of all land creatures. Tourism in the Great Barrier Reef is a flourishing business. Every year, the stretch of Australian coast is visited by thousands of people, and enormous floating structures have been built to cater for them. These impressive tourist complexes serve a double purpose. Not only do they make it possible for people of all ages and physical condition to see the coral reef and the animals that live there, but they also minimize the impact that such numbers of people would have on this ecosystem if they visited it individually. Every diver armed with flippers and goggles poses a threat to the fragile structures of the reef. The tourists who come here are, in the main, staunch defenders of nature, but in many cases they do not realize that despite their powerful calcareous structures, the corals are extremely fragile creatures, and even the turbulence caused by the swimmer can mean death. In an attempt to remedy this situation, an Irish biologist has established a free school in the city of Cairns, but a very special school.
If you are interested in a geography lesson, you are much more interested in the big, friendly animals that are out there, huge, big fish, like this one, that we in the diving industry call wally. And there are hundreds of these wallies out there, but some of these wallies are just incredible fish because they will swim right over the scuba divers.
Paddy Colwell teaches in a very accessible, enjoyable way about the structure, workings and care of the Great Barrier Reef. And he does it in such a way that very few remain indifferent, because a combination of theatre, slides and mime communicate in a way which is both direct and unforgettable.
Really very easy to remove. And Wally's two eyes sit out, way out on the side of his head. All these fish are at home. All these corals are also at home. The only foreigner that's going to be out there, it's going to be you. So when you enter their home, would you please treat it with respect?
What I do is I teach people about the Great Barrier Reef. So when the people go out to the reef, they know what they're looking at. And they can talk about it afterwards. And they remember what they've seen. And they're not worried about the false potential dangers Hollywood puts in people's heads. 7 years ago, the biggest company in Cairns, which took 300,000 people out the reef that year, had a slide video show to explain to people how the reef worked, and it was completely wrong. And the dive companies out there used to do things which were not very good for the reef, like allowing people handle coral, allowing people to pick up things they shouldn't pick up. And what I've done is I've explained to the people much more about the reef. So when people go out there, they enjoy it better, and they've got less negative impact on the reef.
Efforts like those of Paddy Colwell are achieving tourism which better knows the reef and so is more responsible on matters related to its protection. And this, in turn, opens up new possibilities to the visitors to the Great Barrier Reef themselves, who are now beginning to appreciate and understand even those animals which up to now have had the worst reputations. Sharks were, until very recently, accursed animals. We now know more about their behavior and their incredible biology, and people are able to enjoy watching them in their natural environment, supervised, of course, by expert divers. The divers gather next to a large metal cage while different species of shark prowl around in the vicinity. Then, at the right moment, the guides give the sign and the divers go into the cages. They're about to witness for themselves the powerful predatory instincts of the sharks. A container is opened and a float rises to the surface, dragging behind it a string of dead tuna fish. At first, nothing seems to be happening until a shark gives the first bite. Then, all hell is let loose. Few animals are as voracious as sharks when they detect food and go into what has been called a feeding frenzy. This is when they really become dangerous, but from inside the cages they can be observed without danger. The frenzy of the sharks as they devour the food is such that it can be seen from the surface. There, those who are not able to dive can see how the sharks desperately hold on to their prey, refusing to let go even when they are lifted up into the air. Then peace returns once more. The food has disappeared, and the impressive sharks return to their slow wanderings around the azure depths of the reef. The coral reef is an oasis in an ocean which is poor in nutrients. The majority of the energy which keeps it alive is generated by the reef itself, as the tiny symbiotic algae inside the corals transform the sunlight into elements which can be assimilated by the rest of the community. In the next layer up on the food chain, millions of filtering animals extract every last drop of essential nutrients from the water. These feather duster worms follow the example of the corals which protect them. They bring out their spiral gills and let the current carry the food to them. The sea cucumbers do not have the protection of the coral skeleton, but they have the advantage of being bigger, and they also use their mouth tentacles to extract food from the water. In the next step up on the food chain, we find important colonies of herbivores, hunters of microorganisms and small invertebrates. This legion of predators in miniature has specialized in obtaining food from the most inaccessible corners of the coral maze. The key to survival is to develop a mouth which is able to reach food that no one else can get to. And none has achieved this so efficiently as the parrotfish. Their secret is jaws, which are capable of crushing the calcareous skeleton of the corals. In that way, the entire reef becomes a gigantic larder as they devour the coral polyps. Not all animals have opted for such direct solutions. Many others choose adaptive strategies rather than physiological changes, new behavior rather than new body structures. And one of the most efficient strategies was the union between different species. The transparent body of these shrimps means they remain invisible between the stinging tentacles of an anemone. When the anemone hunts, the shrimps take any leftover food and, in return, clean the anemone of impurities and parasites. The clownfish also works in symbiosis with the anemones. In this case, it is the anemone which eats the food left by its guests, and in return protects the fish with its poisonous tentacles. This defense is not a voluntary act on the part of the anemone, but rather an achievement of the clownfish, which have developed a covering which is immune to the poison of these invertebrates. A covering which, by the way, must be constantly renewed. That is why the clownfish so often rub themselves up against the tentacles. If they did not constantly vaccinate themselves in this way, they would lose their immunity and the anemones would kill them. You can never have enough protection here in the reef. Night is the time when the hunters come out and threatening shadows lurk in the silent coral world. The blackfin barracudas dive down to the bottom in search of prey. As they evolved, their bodies became darker with sharply contrasting stripes. Now there is no light, and this camouflage is unnecessary. But as they grow increasingly excited in the hunt, the stripes become more marked. Inside the reef, enemies are visible from a considerable distance during the daytime, so they normally hunt only in the dark of the night. The fish then seek refuge in the maze of coral. The same skeletons which protect the polyps provide refuge to the entire colony associated with them. This potato cod is hunting. The coral which protects it from the large predators such as sharks or men now becomes an obstacle standing between it and its prey. As night draws on and it searches around the reef, its hunger becomes even more intense. Then it finds a parrotfish resting beneath the protection of a ledge of coral and decides to make a desperate attack. Other hunters are much more sophisticated. For the lionfish, the most beautiful of the pteroids in the reef, calm and patience are the keys to its hunting strategy. Its enormous poisonous fins move slowly like seaweed floating in the calm night waters of the reef. The small fish of the seabed are wary of any movement which may be evidence of another fish in the enveloping dark. But the gentle rippling movements of the pteroids as they swim are disconcerting. They barely move, but rather simply allow themselves to be carried along by the water. No one would suspect that this is an impatient hunter on the prowl, and it is not long before these small fish emerge from their hiding places, convinced that it is merely something lifeless moving with the current. But when they come close enough, the impassive lionfish suddenly springs to life, attacking his prey with deadly efficiency. The existence of so many and so well-equipped predators means that security measures become an absolute priority for all species in the reef. A safe hiding place can mean the difference between life and death, and each species develops its own particular means of protection. The blue-streaked goby builds its own lair by digging holes below the rocks of the seabed. For this, it uses its enormous mouth in which it transports the fragments of coral and shells which form the sand of the reef, and from time to time, it uses its powerful tail as a brush. The safety of a cave or the protection of poisonous allies is a priority for almost all the animals of the Great Barrier Reef. And as always occurs when demand is high, there's fierce competition among species. This can be seen in the constant struggle to establish and defend one's territory. No one wants to share their safety. The anemone fish, those that live under the protection of its tentacles, are incredibly possessive and territorial. And this pair of butterfly fish is about to receive a powerful demonstration of this. The Great Barrier Reef contains an incredible diversity of species and of experiments in adaptation to ensure survival. Many have adapted ingenious systems of hiding, warning, or confusing. The copper-banded butterfly fish uses a false eye, which draws attacking predators to the opposite end from its true eye. In this way, when it escapes, it will do so in precisely the opposite direction to that which its attacker is expecting. The nudibranches display bright colors which warn that their flesh tastes unpleasant or is even poisonous. This warning is so effective that they are able to swim around in full view of everyone. Others, however, choose to hide behind their perfect camouflage. The crinoids or sea lilies related to the starfish and sea urchins disguise themselves as seaweed, and they do it so well that many of the divers that visit the reef each year are not even aware of their existence. A number of different classes of animals have opted for direct defense and have acquired persuasive weapons. This is the case of the unicorn fish, which has a sharp spike on its head, or the surgeonfish, which have razor-like scalpels on the muscular base of their tails. All these strategies have been perfected over time to produce incredible specialists. Among the cephalopods, camouflage has been taken to such extremes that they have become the chameleons of the sea. Because not only have they acquired skins which makes them invisible against the background, but have even developed bodies capable of changing color and shape as and when they wish. The octopi of the reef live above all on the seabed, where they find refuge and food. And as the topography of the bottom of the reef is very varied and visibility very high, they have become extremely shy. Even inoffensive fish make them wary, causing constant changes in the shape and color of their bodies as they try to blend into their backgrounds. And that's quite a challenge, because the octopus is almost black, and here the colors of the seabed are very light. This time, the octopus has not been able to disguise itself, and so it moves away in search of surroundings it can more easily imitate. A cuttlefish, a ferocious hunter. If the octopus has problems blending into the background on the seabed, then the cuttlefish has an even more difficult task, as it spends its life swimming in the open waters. But like the octopus, the cuttlefish has acquired the ability to change the shape and color of its body And it has been so successful in this that it has become not only a means of camouflage, but also a way in which to communicate with others of the same species. Two cuttlefish have met in the shallow waters within the reef. Without coming any closer, the two cephalopods exchange messages. They are both males and cuttlefish are territorial, so the intruder receives a clear warning from a distance. Get out of my territory, or there'll be a fight. The intruder moves off in search of quieter corals. Communication through body language has avoided the unnecessary waste of energy which a fight would have meant, and each one goes on its way without even having come close to its fellow cuttlefish. In the clear waters of the reef, hiding, warning, or confusion are, as we have seen, priorities for the immense majority of animals. How then can we explain the attitude of this creature? Small and defenseless, brightly colored and moving about freely in the water in a manner which is bound to attract attention, the cleaner wrasse seems to be crying out to be eaten. But no other fish moves around the reef in greater safety. Its secret is that it provides the community with an invaluable service, which all species, however large or dangerous, welcome. When a fish comes close to one of these cleaner fish, it swims into its mouth and gills, where it removes impurities and parasites. In this way, the labroides provide a service, grooming and hygiene, and in exchange are granted immunity. The system works so well that the cleaner wrasse now has imitators. A number of different species in the reef have developed markings similar to the cleaner fish, like these striped catfish. And the trick generally works. But there's a problem. There's always someone ready to take unfair advantage. Like this small blenny, which uses its disguise not only to escape danger when it comes face to face with the powerful hunters of the reef. When the false cleaner fish approaches, the larger fish open their mouths and gills, ready to be inspected and cleaned. But when the blenny is allowed into the soft tissue of the gills, instead of cleaning them, it bites viciously into them and then flees, taking with it a mouthful of flesh. Inside the cracks and crevices of the seabed, there are also cleaning stations for the hunters that live among the rocks and the coral, and this striped cleaner shrimp of the Stenopus family is in charge of this delicate task. Every opportunity to obtain food is taken. That is the overriding law of the reef. Make use of absolutely everything, recycle everything. Wherever there is a chance of obtaining energy, no matter how difficult or risky it may be, there is sure to be some specialist ready to grab it. And that is the key to the miracle. That is how the richest and most diverse of all Australian ecosystems has arisen here in the waters of a barren sea. All the biological variety and wealth of the Great Barrier Reef is due to the small, delicate coralline polyps. They are the first essential link in the food chain, and the skeletons of millions of their ancestors form the habitat which supports all these life forms. But the influence of the tiny polyps and their powerful skeletons is felt far beyond the waters in which they grow. The over 2,500 reefs which make up the Great Barrier are the largest coral formation in the world. This impenetrable wall, which can be seen as a white line from the moon, protects the coast of Australia from the pounding of the waves and the wind from the Coral Sea. So many of the ecosystems on land along the northeast coast also depend on the shelter it provides. On the many coral islands dotted along the Great Barrier Reef, birds find a refuge in which to regain their strength and lay their eggs. Land animals are unable to reach them, and so the eggs will be safe. The reef is thus an enormous breeding ground. Many birds, like these masked boobies, are able to raise their young thanks to the tiny islands of the reef. Here they are safe. They can rest and the sea is full of readily accessible food. Both in and out of the water, the role of the polyps as benefactors has contributed to land and sea life in a way that scientists are only now, little by little, beginning to understand, and which reveals a network of interactions which no one could have imagined. What once seemed to be the most insignificant animals of this ecosystem have proven to be the very foundation of life in innumerable biological communities, both in the sea and on the continent of Australia. But now that we are beginning to understand them, new enemies have arrived, which threaten the survival of the polyps and as a result of the entire Great Barrier Reef system. The crown of thorns starfish is one of these. No one knows why, but periodically since 1960, entire legions of these starfish invade the coral, feeding on the polyps. Everything would seem to indicate it is the indirect result of the presence of man. It may be the use of pesticides which kill the plankton that eat the eggs and larvae of the crown of thorns. Or perhaps it is due to the indiscriminate fishing of the sea snails which kill and eat these starfish. What is not in doubt is that the starfish advance unstoppable through the reef, leaving behind them the bleached white skeletons of the coral wherever they go. At the end of the 1970s, the start of massive bleaching of some reefs was detected. For no apparent reason, the algae living inside the corals were dying, and with them, of course, the polyps. Since then, this massive bleaching has increased, and the scientific community is now starting to suspect that the causes may lie thousands of miles away. In the Marine Biology Department of the University of Sydney, the biologist Ove Hug Goldberg and his team are beginning to understand the causes and the consequences of this bleaching of the coral reefs. All the evidence would seem to point towards the same cause, which is raising the alarm in almost all the ecosystems of the Earth: global warming or changes in the climate of our planet.
The type of research that I'm doing at the moment involves trying to understand how temperature rise affects corals. And what we've found is quite dramatic. A 1 degree temperature rise causes corals to lose the tiny little plants that live inside them. When you normally look at a coral, right, it's a brown color, and that's due to these tiny symbiotic organisms called zooxanthellae. And these are just like the plants in your garden. They provide the animal with all of the things that you can capture from sunlight, all the sugars and so on. Now, when you increase the temperature, these plants get sick and they get spat out of the coral. And so the result is they lose their brown color. Now, what we've found is that corals don't really have the ability to change their physiology, the internal workings of their bodies, to cope with this change. And so it's very worrying that we've got temperatures early next century, and I'm talking 2030, 2040, at which we're going to see coral bleaching, it would seem, across the planet on a yearly basis. And that's of great concern because it may actually destroy reefs on a global scale.
Factors such as the burning of fossil fuels on the other side of the world may wipe out the corals of Australia. Distant and apparently unrelated causes are killing the polyps and destroying the reefs. And this is the main difficulty facing the scientists in their attempts to remedy the situation. How can you explain to the powerful industrialized nations that they need to control their energy consumption, introduce generally unpopular measures in order to save tiny living beings that inhabit waters on the other side of the world?
Well, a lot of people will ask the question, do we really need the corals that you find on coral reefs? Because maybe they're just good places to go diving and we can do without them because it may be too difficult to solve the problem. Well, we've got to realize that the corals that live on the reefs actually build the reefs. And without them, we lose all of those other things that go with reefs, the thousands of different animals and plants that live on reefs, and all of the fisheries and tourism and all of that that's associated with them. So it really is of great concern. There's another reason that we have to preserve coral reefs, and that's to do with the fact that coral reefs actually protect coastlines. All around the world, if you go to a tropical paradise, you'll notice that a couple of 100 meters off the coastline is the coral reef, and all the waves are crashing on that reef. Now, without that coral reef, you have those waves crashing on the landscape. That would change entire coastlines and societies. Now, there are some very worrying signs from a number of different research groups that we are actually seeing a slow erosion of reefs. And if we do have that, places like Queensland in Australia, which has 2,100 kilometres of a protective barrier, would suddenly become exposed to wave energy. If that happens, we lose seagrasses, mangroves, and a whole series of different ecosystems that are associated with those places.
Night is falling in the Great Barrier Reef. At the end of November, when the water reaches the highest temperatures of the year, and just a few days after the full moon, there's a tremendous commotion in the reef. The fish awake from their sleep and in the faint light of the moon gather in their thousands to enjoy a succulent feast. It is the one time of year, and for just a few nights, when there is more than enough food for everyone. Because once a year and all at the same time, taking advantage of the warm waters and the full moon, the polyps spawn. Each polyp releases a tiny package which contains eggs and sperm. Thousands of these reproductive capsules rise to the surface of the sea where they open, initiating the formation of millions of new polyps. Some corals are not hermaphrodites and release the eggs and the sperm separately, which then join in this nighttime frenzy of reproduction. This is the beginning of a new cosmos, the synthesis of the very nature of the coral, where the smallest and most fragile sow the seeds which will grow into complex worlds and thousands of different life forms. Like a galaxy in miniature, the beginnings of new polyps float and drift in the coral sea. They are so powerful they support the life of entire ecosystems, and so delicate that a rise of just 3 degrees in the temperature would wipe them out for once and for all. And in the southern night, Millions of these fragile fortresses float adrift, unaware that their uncertain future is now in the hands of mankind.